And now, here on the 63rd weekly Friday show from Radio Free UK, before we move on to Nigel Farage's speech at the Donald Trump rally, we have a slight diversion. This is an item from ABC Radio about free speech. I particularly included this because it includes Brendan O'Neill, Spike's editor. And while overall they may be a bit left-wing for my taste, they certainly have the right views on free speech, and they are behind the only visible Invoke Article 50 Now campaign. So, moving from one former colony to another, let's go to Australia.
It's the conservative cause célèbre. It's an emblematic crusade for freedom of speech against, well, some see it as repression, the repression of political correctness. Section 18C of the 1975 Racial Discrimination Act, the enemy of free speech, a shackle on liberty. Now, seldom has a little piece of law created so much aggravation. It's rarely out of the news these days.
David Leinhelm's submission uses 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. He wants to see the section abolished and says his complaint is a test case.
If you want to take offence, that's your choice. You have the choice of choosing another feeling. Offence is always taken, not given. So if you don't want to be offended, it's up to you. Don't be offended. That's it. You know, we're not responsible for the feelings of other people. None of us are.
Senator Leinhelm is complaining about an article published a week ago where a Fairfax columnist described him as a boorish, supercilious know-all and said he was behaving with the overconfidence of an angry white male.
Offence is always taken, not given. What's the truth in this? Does the Racial Discrimination Act really stop free speech in its tracks, or is it just a law that codifies a basic politeness, a civility? Professor Katharine Gelber is an expert on freedom of speech and the regulation of hate speech. She's from the School of Political Science at the University of Queensland. Brendan O'Neill is a visitor to these shores, editor of Spiked Online. Welcome both, and Brendan, to you first. I mean, make the case. Why is having the capacity to vilify people on the grounds of race or religion so fundamental to the idea of free speech?
Because the state should have no role whatsoever in policing what people can think and say. It's really simple. And that must go across the board. It must include both speech that we think is good and interesting and useful, and speech that we think is bad and boring and possibly evil, because free speech either applies to everyone or it applies to no one. And it's just a very basic principle of anyone who believes in freedom, which is that behaviour is very different, actions are very different. But if we're talking about thought and speech, the police and the state have no role to play there.
So the state should be able to make a law against murder?
Yes.
But the state should not be able to make a law against me calling you a such and such on the basis of your religion?
Absolutely, particularly religion. I mean, I think the whole of Section 18C should be scrapped. I'm really alarmed at those people who are calling for it to be expanded to include religion. Mankind fought for a very long time for the right to blaspheme, for the right to mock people's religious beliefs, for the right to not believe in God, to say the Bible is nonsense, to ridicule all forms of ideological and religious faith. I'm really alarmed at the way in which primarily people on the left now seem willing to backtrack that and introduce new blasphemy laws by the back door.
Katharine, what sort of cases are typically caught up by 18C of the Race Discrimination Act?
Well, the first thing to say is that 18C isn't used terribly often. People who put the kind of point of view that Brendan has just put often say that these kind of laws will stifle free speech. So I did a large research project recently on the impact of these kind of laws on public discourse in Australia over 25 years. And the answer is that they're relatively infrequently used, only in really significant, usually, I should say, in really significant cases. And there's no significant evidence that people in Australia are prevented from engaging in robust debate on all manner of political issues.
I mean, isn't that a point there, Brendan, that last one? I mean, we have so many people railing against this. I mean, no one's freedom of speech is being constrained in this argument around 18C. I mean, it's everywhere you turn is people saying this stuff. I mean, how is free speech being hampered there?
I think this is to underestimate the chilling effect that legislation like this can have. So it's not simply the cases in which it's used, which I think are outrageous, but also it chills the sense of what people can think and what people can say. And also, Australia is heading down a slippery slope because we've had laws like this across Europe for slightly longer than you guys, and our laws go much further than yours. And we've had situations where Christian street preachers have been arrested and thrown in police cells for reading sections of the Book of Revelations that people consider to be homophobic. We've had a situation where people have been arrested and fined for describing the preparation of halal meat as barbaric. So, and there are lots and lots of incidents in Europe where people are arrested and fined and sometimes imprisoned for expressing hateful or very strong opinions about people on the basis of their race, religion, or ethnicity.
I mean,
you don't want to go down that road.
But isn't that sort of legislation in Europe, isn't that prompted by the examples of history, things like the Holocaust, for example?
I don't think so, because in fact Nazi Germany is a very good example. The Weimar Republic actually had hate speech legislation. It had legislation that restricted the right to defame Jews, for example, and some prominent Nazis prior to coming to power were arrested under that legislation. And if anything, it benefited them, because what they were able to say was, look, this horrible pro-Jewish regime won't even let us say what we want to say. If anything, hate speech legislation benefits the most hateful people by allowing themselves to present themselves as martyrs. I think anti-racists, and I count myself as an anti-racist, should be the most opposed to things like Section 18C, because it deprives us of our right and our responsibility to know and see and understand racism and to challenge it in public debate.
Brendan O'Neill's editor of Spiked Online, and Katharine Gelber is a free speech expert from the University of Queensland. We're talking about 18C and free speech. I mean, Katharine, what do you say to that? I mean, what's the intention of something like our 1975 Racial Discrimination Act? What does that seek to achieve through law?
Well, the racial hatred provisions, the Section 18C, were actually introduced in 1995, so 20 years after the Racial Discrimination Act itself was introduced. And their aim is to draw a line in the sand, to say, yes, we can have robust political debate on any manner of political issues, but when you do engage in that debate, you shouldn't harm people. So one of the things that Brendan said a moment ago was that actions are different from thought. And of course they are, but it's also true, and we've known this for at least half a century, that when we speak, we do things with our words. When somebody knocks on your door and you say, come in, they're not giving themselves permission to enter your room. They're not taking it for themselves. You're giving it to them. You're giving them permission. So, of course, when we say things that are vilifying, we are handing out harm to the targets of that speech. It's absolutely ridiculous to say that there's a differentiation there, then that's pure thought. It's actually an action. And the other things that Brendan was talking about are all the usual tropes of people who oppose this kind of legislation, alleging a chilling effect. Well, I've done the research and there's no evidence of a chilling effect on public debate in Australian public discourse over the last 25 years. The slippery slope argument, there's no evidence that in Australia we're going down a slippery slope of increasingly trying to regulate people's speech. And the martyr effect, well, again, 25 years of research into 25 years of effects of hate speech laws in Australia shows that there is relatively little risk of a martyr effect. And certainly the claim that Brendan made that that anti-racists would gain more benefit from dropping 18C than from retaining it is simply not sustained by the evidence.
But Brendan, if you vilify me on the basis of race, aren't you impinging on my right to be free of that sort of vilification? I mean, why does your right to say that overwhelm my right not to hear your vilification?
Because you don't have the freedom not to be offended. And freedom of speech trumps all other freedoms.
Why is that? I mean, you assert that. Why is that the case?
Because freedom of speech is the freedom that makes all other freedoms possible. If you don't have freedom of speech, then you don't have the freedom to express yourself. You don't have the freedom the right to vote loses all meaning. You don't have the freedom to political organisation. You don't have the freedom of association, because you can't exchange ideas. You can't hand out pamphlets. You can't set up political parties.
But surely we have all those things in good effect, but without this edge of racial vilification.
Of course, but freedom of speech is the thing that underpins all of those other freedoms. And, I would say Katharine was presented as an expert in freedom of speech. It sounds to me like she's an expert in how to restrain and restrict freedom of speech. And what it sounds like she has done is advocacy research, where you do research which is designed to prove a certain thing. Now, there are other huge numbers of researchers and experts and also lay people, and let's not forget, lay people also have a very strong and persuasive views on freedom of speech, who think that actually these laws do chill freedom, do make people think there are certain things they can't say. And the thing that worries me most is this conflation of thought and action. This idea that speech is very similar or the same as action. That is the hallmark of every tyrannical regime. Every tyrannical regime has always began by erasing the distinction between thought and action so that you could have thought crime. And we are reaching a situation where I would say that hate speech crime, is actually very similar to the idea of thought crime.
Katharine, much for you to respond to there, I think.
Yes, well, Brendan, I don't think has read my research, so it's a bit rich to call it advocacy research when you don't know what it is. The idea that so Brendan draws the line on offence and says that people don't have a right to be offended. Actually, he also said that he thought that freedom of speech was vitally important, and on that he and I agree. Freedom of speech is vitally important to the enjoyment of all other freedoms, and it's a freedom that I very, very much support. But to me, freedom of speech doesn't mean that anybody can say anything they want any time they want, because that means that the people who are the loudest or the most vociferous or the bullies or the people with the most money are the ones who get to say what they want, and other people who are marginalised or excluded or discriminated against by the speech of others get marginalised or excluded. So to me there's a line in the sand, and the line in the sand is when the government says you can engage in robust political debate around any topic you like, but you can't harm people with what you're saying. And so we're just going to draw the line at harm. We're going to say that you can have robust differences of opinion, you can have a robust political debate, but we're going to draw the line at harm. So what Brendan calls offence, I call harm. And in fact, the interpretation of hate speech law in Australia has relied very much on that harm threshold, even though Section 18C has the word offend in it. Everybody who's read the judgments on that provision understands that the way the courts have interpreted that provision is that that provision amounts to drawing a line in the sand against significant public harms. It does not draw a line in the sand against people's hurt feelings or merely hurting people's feelings. It draws a line in the sand on significant public harm.
And surely, Brendan, that freedom of speech is guaranteed by Section 18D, which says that 18C does not render unlawful anything said or done reasonably and in good faith in performance and artistic work in the course of any statement, publication, discussion or debate made or held for a genuine academic, artistic or scientific purpose, in the public interest, in making or publishing a fair and accurate report. I mean, these are substantial safeguards.
And also it says if it is fair and reasonable. Who decides this?
The courts,
judge,
by and large.
The judge, the state, the police. Who decides this? How are we going to give such authority to the authorities to decide when our speech is fair and reasonable?
But surely our culture is based on giving that sort of authority to the legal system all the time.
Not my kind of culture, certainly not when it comes to freedom of speech. And I think Katharine is what free speech campaigners refer to as a butthead. I believe in free speech, but, and we've just heard her say that she believes in free speech very passionately and she loves the idea, but not when people say something that she finds offensive. So she doesn't believe in freedom of speech, and we see these people all the time now who say that they think freedom of speech is the most important ideal, but there must be a line in the sand. But you must not be allowed to say this, but you must not be allowed to think that. And if you are calling on the government, explicitly calling on the government, as Katharine has just done, to draw a line in the sand on matters of speech, then you do not believe in freedom of speech. In fact, what you believe in is privileged speech. And what you have in Australia at the moment, as a result of Section 18C, is a system of privileged speech. You are given the privilege to speak so long as you do not break those rules. That, to my mind, is very obviously not freedom of speech. And the thing that concerns me since being here, and Jonathan, you introduced this as Section 18C as the great kind of conservative cause, getting rid of Section 18C. My argument is, where is the left on this issue? The only reason the right can pose, I think, as the key defenders of freedom of speech is because the left and academia have abandoned it so thoroughly.
And yet, I mean, there is an argument that the argument against 18C is a proxy for people who feel the progressive culture has gone too far. It's too liberal. There's this paradoxical argument for conservatism that's dressed up as this argument in favour of freedom.
Yeah, well, that's not my argument. My argument against all hate speech laws in Europe, of which we have many, is precisely because I want to know where these hateful ideas are. I want to know who holds them. I want to know what they consist of. So, for example, in France...
But by giving them oxygen.
By giving them oxygen, so that I then have the right and the responsibility as a citizen who despises racism to expose those ideas, to challenge them, and to defeat them.
Katharine, bring you in here. I mean, but Brendan mentions privilege. I mean, isn't the intention of something like 18C is to protect the less privileged against the more privileged and vocal?
Well, precisely. Of course it is. And of course, Brendan completely misrepresented everything I just say when he said that I drew the line. I said that when people say something I find offensive, that crosses the line. That's precisely not what I said. I said that when people say something that harms others through their speech, that is where the line should be drawn. And Brendan himself conceded that, yes, we have laws against murder. We also have laws against defamation. We have laws against inciting people to commit crimes. We have all kinds of laws where the state has drawn a line and said when it amounts to harm, a significant public harm, then the state can intervene. So that's all I'm saying, that it's very consistent with that.
It's a robust conversation, and it is guaranteed to continue in the weeks and months ahead. My thanks to both participants this morning. Professor Katharine Gelber, an expert in freedom of speech and hate speech from the School of Political Science, the University of Queensland. Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked Online, and if you're a fan of Brendan's work, you'll catch him tomorrow night on Q&A on ABC TV. This, however, is Sunday Extra, and it's 9:25.